Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 224, the Battle of Fair Oaks, Redux. Last episode, we talked Ulysses S. Grant and analyzed his performance during the war. I think while we are not blown away by the list of battles and the results and the performances in those battles, it does give us a good appreciation of the versatility of Grant as a battlefield leader. This episode, we will rewind again and look back on another battle that, while I covered, I think I would like to add a little bit more detail. We are going to 1862 and refighting the Battle of Seven Pines, or Fair Oaks. Before we do that, let's talk about our Patreon content, and of course, we are rolling off of another movie review here. This one's going to be Rio Lobo, and that one is going to be a John Wayne film, one of his last films, actually. So we've done John Wayne in the past. Horse Soldiers comes to mind as one of the movies that we did. We talked about that. There's probably a little bit more there than we thought. In terms of Rio Lobo, it is kind of a mixed bag. Is it a good Western? Is it a good Civil War movie? There's some Civil War stuff in it. What is going to be the classification there? I talk about that in this Patreon episode. So if that sounds like something that would interest you, there is a link in the show description. Of course, those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They're greatly appreciated. So the rationale I had for this episode is that while we covered Fair Oaks or Seven Pines in the main narrative, I think we made things a little more confusing. As we already kind of talked about with First Manassas, some of the early battles were unfortunate casualties of the early episodes. I think there was a different view of what the podcast should look like back then. I also like to think that we really hit our stride in terms of the narrative and mixed in well the episode to set up our big pieces of major battles of the war. It is not lost on me that when you look at the war as a whole, then Seven Pines is probably an afterthought, certainly compared to our list of top 10 battles. That same year, we will not only have Shiloh, but Second Manassas, Antietam, and Fredericksburg. We even have the 7 Days, which seem to also overshadow Seven Pines. I think that in the narrative specifically, I have thrown out that Seven Pines is really more important for the fact that Joseph Johnson is wounded than anything else, which might be just a tad harsh. At the time, this was one of the bigger battles yet fought. It does highlight offensive action, so gives some discredit to the argument that Johnson only wants to be on the defensive. In a situation where the war is turning definitely against the South, it might have been a bigger L if Richmond had been forced to be abandoned. The war might have been very different from that point on. No Lee, no Sherman, no Grant as president probably, McClellan is the hero of the war, and emancipation probably does not happen, or at least not as soon as it otherwise does. So Seven Pines, while still an early battle of the war, holds significance to try to give another pass at it. So let's maybe set the stage for the Battle of Seven Pines. It actually lines up nicely with the events we talked about with First Manassas. That engagement, of course, happens in July of 1861, and at the end of that month, McClellan would take control of the Union forces. His arrival was originally promising, but soon it would become apparent that he was not interested in fast action, staring at Joseph Johnson's army in Northern Virginia and digging in around the nation's capital. Radical Republicans would grow weary of McClellan. Lincoln, too, would want some kind of action, eventually given an order of march for the forces gathered. McClellan, for his part, would want to take control back from the president, and to be fair to him, he was still building a large, formidable army. This is still being early in the war. Remember, too, that First Manassas has this fallout of individuals who are saying, hey, these volunteer troops weren't ready. Really, they weren't ready on either side, as we kind of highlighted in the First Manassas redo episode that we did. Obviously, they needed to have more training, more time to be put together as a cohesive unit. That army was only some 40,000 men, and it was really hard to control. So if McClellan was building this army of 120,000 men, then obviously there needs to be more thought put into that logistically, in terms of training, in terms of supply, in terms of marching, right? So there's so much more that's going into this army. So we can kind of see where McClellan kind of has a point where he's not really acting as quickly as maybe he should have, but there is at least some good reason to that. The plan from the young Napoleon was to land behind the Confederate forces at Urbana, wedging his army between them and Richmond, but the Confederates were prepared for McClellan to make such a move. Alternatively, McClellan would shift to the peninsula, joining Mexican War veteran John Wool's command at Fort Monroe, still a foothold in the Tidewater region of Virginia. Remember, though, that while McClellan maneuvered, Lincoln would still wish to protect Washington. Stonewall Jackson is operating in the Shenandoah, or he will be operating in the Shenandoah, so there's at least some Confederate forces lurking in the general vicinity. Irvin McDowell would have a command of troops at Fredericksburg, checking any rebel move to the north. Troops would have to be shifted back and forth into the valley as Jackson got some much-needed Confederate W's. We have the first failure of Nathaniel Banks at First Winchester, if you recall, potentially a big disaster for the Union troops. Jackson, as we know, was all about trying to get into the enemy's country and laying waste. McClellan would have an opportunity, though, to land on the peninsula and face the token force there commanded by Prince John Magruder, before he could push on, hopefully, to the Confederate capital. Importantly, he would think that additional troops could potentially be reinforced. Johnson would toy with a plan to act offensively, but realize it was necessary at this point to be on the defensive. Just to give us an idea of the timeline, right? Jackson has the Battle of Kernstown in March of 1862, and then what we are talking about in terms of Seven Pines, Fair Oaks is not until the end of May, beginning of June 1862. So there we have the importance of Jackson even having this offering at Kernstown. A lot of people consider that to be his only real defeat, right? That's kind of the narrative around Kernstown, is that it could have been this big thing. It might have been a Confederate victory just as well, or at least a Pyrrhic victory for the Confederates, holding the field, but then probably having to withdraw anyway. But we have Kernstown having that significance in that he strikes the Union Army in a situation where they're already starting to think about moving troops into the central part of Virginia that could support McClellan, or at least check any kind of advance to Washington to free up additional troops for him. So that is why when we say that the beginning of the Valley Campaign is important, it is definitely keeping the troops from being able to shift to McClellan. Would they actually have been used in the army, right? We don't know. It's hard to say. But the fact that Jackson has this operation that he begins will prevent that. McClellan's army, of course, had adopted the corps system, something that had been instituted while the forces had gathered in Washington. This would mean less direct control by their commanding officer, but for such a large army, would be important for the field. He would have the 2nd Corps under Edwin Sumner, the 3rd under Samuel Heintzelman, the 4th under Erasmus Keyes, and the 5th under Fitzjohn Porter, with the 6th under William B. Franklin as well. Sumner would have divisions under Israel Richardson and John Sedgwick. Fighting Dick Richardson was a native of Vermont and an old Army veteran, having already served at 1st Manassas. He has brigades under Oliver O. Howard, the future hero of Gettysburg, the Irish Brigade under Irish Revolutionary Thomas Francis Meagher, and a brigade under Blinky French. Uncle John Sedgwick would have brigades under Wells Gorman, who's going to be the former commander of the 1st Minnesota, William Wallace Burns, who will be essentially sidelined as a result of being a McClellan supporter, and Napoleon Dana, a West Pointer, who would go on to be a major general in the West. Heintzelman has divisions under Joseph Hooker and Phil Kearny, making it quite the aggressive force. Hooker has Cuvier Grover, who goes on to serve in the 18th Corps, the famous Daniel Sickles with the Excelsior Brigade, and Francis Patterson and the New Hampshire Brigade, one regiment of which is commanded by Gershom Mott, who goes on to serve as brigade and divisional commander in the Army of the Potomac. Patterson would die by self-inflicted gunshot wound later in the year. Artillery for this division was going to be under the most capable Charles Wainwright as well. Kearny has Charles Jameson, who was in politics and would fall ill later in the year, David Birney, who will rise through the ranks, serving through Petersburg, and Hiram Berry, who will be killed on the 3rd day at Chancellorsville. Keyes has Darius Couch and Silas Casey. Couch was on the shortlist to take over for Hooker prior to Gettysburg. Casey writes a manual on infantry tactics, but unfortunately this battle does not go well for him. Couch has brigades under John Peck, John Abercrombie, and Charles Devens. Peck had served in Mexico and would go on to command at Suffolk. Abercrombie would be relegated to the defenses of Washington post-campaign. Devens was a Harvard man who will continue to serve, eventually taking over division command, serving at Petersburg. Casey has brigades under Henry Nagley, Henry Wessels, and Ennis Palmer. Nagley will go on to serve in the Carolinas along with Wessels and the New Yorker Palmer, Wessels being the commander at Plymouth. Porter will have divisions under George Morrell and tardy George Sykes, with artillery under Henry Hunt. Morrell would have Martindale, Butterfield, and James McQuaid. Sykes has mostly regulars and G.K. Warren. Franklin has Henry Slocum and Baldy Smith, two future corps commanders, as division leaders. Slocum has Taylor, whose New Jersey brigade will get chopped up prior to 2nd Manassas, Joseph Bartlett, and John Newton as brigade commanders. Smith has Winfield Scott Hancock, Bully Brooks, who will go on to play a role at 2nd Fredericksburg and Cold Harbor, as well as John Davidson, who will go on to command cavalry in the West. On the Confederate side, Joseph Johnson has two wings, one under Gustavus Smith and the other under James Longstreet. Smith has divisions under H.C. Whiting and A.P. Hill, both of whom would be killed in 1865. Whiting has Hood and his Texas Brigade in early form, Wade Hampton, not commanding cavalry, Evander Law, Johnson Pettigrew, and Robert Hatton's Tennessee regiments. A.P. Hill has Charles Field, future division commander, Joseph Anderson, who will resign his commission shortly after the campaign, Maxcy Gregg's South Carolinians, and Lawrence O'Brien Branch and his North Carolina men. Branch being one of 6 generals who will die at Antietam. Longstreet has divisions under Richard Anderson, future corps commander, post Longstreet's wounding, D.H. Hill, and the elder Benjamin Huger. Anderson will have Virginians under James Kemper, one of the leaders of Pickett's charge, Pickett himself, Cadmus Wilcox, Raleigh Colston, and Roger Pryor. D.H. Hill has Robert Rhodes, George Anderson, another Antietam casualty, Samuel Garland, who's going to die at South Mountain, Gabriel Rains, who will run the torpedo explosive business in Richmond, and Henry Wise. Huger will have Billy Mahone, Albert Blanchard, who will serve in admin capacities post-campaign, also briefly involved in the defense of Georgia during Sherman's march, as well as Lewis Armistead. Reserved will be under John Bacon Magruder, with divisions under Lafayette McLaws and Daniel Jones, who served at 1st Manassas. McLaws has Paul Semmes, brother to Raphael, and Richard Griffin, while Jones will have Georgians under Toombs and Tige Anderson. So we have a whole lot of names, probably more names than you had with 1st Manassas. We're like, man, these guys are going to go on to do other things later in the war. So this is where we are really starting to get the armies starting to look the way that they will when we think about them proper, where we say, like, say, Antietam or Gettysburg or, you know, that kind of middle 1862 to 1863 territory. March 17th, 1862 would see the beginning of the shift of the Union Army to the peninsula. McClellan would have at his disposal not only his Army of the Potomac, but also the 10,000 men or so under John Wool at Fortress Monroe. Remember that Little Mac is going to be relegated to just commanding the Army of the Potomac, removed from overall Army command so that he could focus on this campaign. Gives you an idea also of just how important the main theater of the war is in a contemporary sense as well, where you have the entire country and you have several different theaters of operation, but really the focus needs to be on this strike at Richmond, because that's probably your best bet to maybe ending the war early. It gives you an idea of what the Lincoln administration is prioritizing. During his time in Washington, he had rubbed the administration the wrong way, especially Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War. For this reason, he is going to find it hard to have his plan unravel the way he would like it. If you recall, Ball's Bluff, in fact, included aftermath of Charles Stone taking the hit from McClellan from the Committee on the Joint Conduct of the War. So the young Napoleon's luster had worn off for many, except maybe the regular army. The Army of the Potomac was considered to be McClellan's own, and he might actually have a point. But with that, it is hard to destroy or inflict harm on something you have created, as we will soon see. Defending the peninsula would be Magruder with his roughly 10,000 men, a defensive line stretching from Yorktown to the James. Utilizing the anchor of the Warwick River, Magruder had built several dams to add to the defense. It had been some time since Ball's Bluff, but remember that the Union forces had forayed from Fortress Monroe in 1861, and things had been stalemated since then. That would be the Battle of Big Bethel, which is a smaller skirmish by our later war standards, but obviously got a lot of fanfare there because it was one of the early actions of the war. April 3rd would mark McClellan's planned movement toward this defensive line, Johnson still hustling his forces down to support Magruder. Heintzelman would take the northern approach, heading to Yorktown, while Keyes would lead the move to the south along the Warwick River. Road conditions on the peninsula would not be conducive for an army, thus making the movement slow. Finding Confederates in a seemingly strong defensive line would put pause for the Union attacks. Besides Galveston, Prince John probably did his best service to the Confederacy during this time by marching and counter-marching troops to make it look like he had more than he actually had. McClellan, who had witnessed contemporary siege tactics during the Crimean War, would hunker down and try to get his heavy siege guns into position. Of course, the roads once again would prove even more difficult for heavy guns to get up in a timely fashion. Remember, too, that McClellan is operating with Pinkerton, and he is the main intelligence gatherer. And Pinkerton, unfortunately, while he was a good investigator, he was not so keen on Army intelligence. It was really outside of his depth. So he is going to add into McClellan's paranoia that there is a larger force in front of him, or the Confederates are constantly going to have this larger amount of troops. He's just going to feed into that. It's really a stark contrast by the time we get into military intelligence by Gettysburg, right? You have a very accurate troop count for Robert E. Lee's army. In fact, Meade is able to receive that intelligence that only Pickett hasn't been engaged yet, right? And that's what is in the Army of Northern Virginia. So it's kind of a sharp contrast between the year 1862 and 1863. And of course, you can also chalk that into the category of how we need to get this kind of experience in order to perform at the higher level, right? It's same for the Army, same for the generals, same for military intelligence and logistics as well, as we've talked about here in some of these recent episodes. Skirmishing along the Warwick River and a probe by Hancock's brigade would punctuate the mostly sitting around that both armies were doing at this time. A more aggressive recon would have shown Magruder as being deceptive, and that a siege might not have been necessary. Johnson, though, would deem the line so hopeless as to have to prepare operations for withdrawal. By the time McClellan was ready to pound the enemy into submission, the rebels were gone. And in this, Johnson does really have a point, because the Union have better siege guns. They would have been able to probably do a lot of damage. So in this sense, we are constantly talking about how Johnson really doesn't want to fight. He always wants to act defensively and maneuver away. In this sense, he is actually quite correct that he probably should have gotten out of there. With Johnson in retreat, McClellan would attempt to catch him. Cavalry under George Stoneman would skirmish with the rear guard under James Longstreet. Johnson realized that he would need to form a delaying action to allow his baggage to get back into Richmond. As the Confederates were already on a secondary defensive line, which included works that Magruder had put together, this seemed like a good place as any. On May 5th, the Battle of Williamsburg, or Fort Magruder, would erupt with an initial attack by Federals being repulsed from the 3rd Corps and Hooker's division. Longstreet would launch a counterattack that would have to be stopped by the timely arrival of reinforcements, including Phil Kearny and his brigade. Hancock's brigade would flank to the left of the rebels, Longstreet throwing Jubal early into an attack to check this. This is going to come to nothing, as D.H. Hill would wisely call off the Union forces having retreated. Longstreet had been able to accomplish a key delay, though, at the cost of 1,600 casualties compared to 2,200 from the Army of the Potomac. Now, Williamsburg, I think, may be deserving of its own redo episode, because at the time it was fairly important. This is where the kinks would begin to be removed from both armies. This was probably the most significant fighting that either army had seen since First Manassas, and the armies are also very different than they had been at First Manassas. So you have that going for it. McClellan is going to see the larger amount of casualties and begin to waver. Well, this is going to pale in comparison to even Seven Pines, as it will overshadow Fort Magruder very quickly. This would stick in the mind of Little Mac. May 7th would see Franklin land at Eltham's Landing, a brief engagement erupting to check his forces conducted by John Bell Hood and his Texas Brigade. Johnson would pull past the Chickahominy River, McClellan meanwhile being surprised that the crossing was not contested. Keyes and Sumner would cross while the remainder of the army stayed on their side. Crucially, Drewry's Bluff would turn back a naval attempt on the city, Norfolk having to be abandoned, and the dreaded CSS Virginia scuttled. Fitzjohn Porter and his 5th Corps on the north side of the Chickahominy would foray toward Hanover Junction, a key juncture to the north side of the city. The Battle of Hanover Courthouse would see Lawrence O'Brien Branch and his command repulsed, with Porter claiming Hanover. Not much was accomplished other than the burning of the courthouse itself, and then also the attention of McClellan being drawn to this northern area. We have talked before about the Chickahominy River in the narrative, but just as a recap, if you were to go and see the river today, if it had not rained in a whole while, then it's not really a whole lot to see. In fact, there are places where it is little more than a stream. However, if it does rain, the importance of the Chickahominy is that there is quite a large floodplain. Swamps around the river can develop, making it a very difficult pass, especially if you are a 19th century field army. As such, the division of the Union forces would prove to be an issue. Johnson had been told he would retreat no more, and thus a plan needed to be developed to act offensively. Erasmus Keyes would find himself and his 4th Corps isolated along with parts of Heintzelman's command, with Sumner still mostly on the other side of the river. The lead element was the 4th Corps, being around Seven Pines, a location named because it did in fact have 7 pine trees. If we are looking at a map, we can see 2 main roadways that would intersect. The Williamsburg Road would run into the middle, going straight west to east. The 9-mile road would run north of the Williamsburg Road before turning southeast, passing through Fair Oak Station along the Richmond and York Railroad before arriving at Seven Pines. Further south was the Charles City Road, passing along the White Oak Swamp. The attack would be scheduled for May 31st, and the plan would be to check Franklin and Porter on the north side of the Chickahominy, while D.H. Hill spearheaded an assault along the Williamsburg Road. Longstreet would lead his men along the 9-mile road and then swing toward the Williamsburg Road. Robert Rhodes, with his command, would move on the Charles City Road as a diversion for the initial assault, while Huger's command would then move to the Charles City Road and attack once Hill had jumped off. The problem is, if you thought that that was confusing, then the Confederate generals also thought that it was, in fact, confusing. More confusing than it probably should have been for this stage of the war. Longstreet would misunderstand and think that he needed to go on the Williamsburg Road before attacking. Huger's command would need to pass him in an attempt to get into position, which they never do. Hill would then attack alone. Gustavus Smith would be needed to support Longstreet, but Longstreet was not there, and thus had Whiting move into position to be reluctant to continue alone. Keyes had moved Abercrombie's command to check against the 9-mile road, his flank exposed there. Palmer, Nagley, and Wessels would be watching the Williamsburg Road, the approach from the south supposedly covered by the White Oak Swamp. Hill's command would thus attack, moving on Silas Casey, who had part of his command station in a clearing in front of Abatty and a redoubt. We have an account of this initial contact. This is from a member of Palmer's brigade. Soon after 1 o'clock, our pickets began to come in sight, returning through the woods and slashing before the enemy. The skirmish line of the enemy pursued them, and we could see both parties jumping over logs and making their way through the bushes, and hear at intervals the sharp reports of their rifles. A little later, a dense mass of men, about 2 rods wide, headed by half a dozen horsemen, marched toward us on the Williamsburg Road. They moved in quick time, carrying their arms on their shoulders, having flags and banners and drummers to beat step. Our batteries opened simultaneously with all their power. Our regiment poured its volleys into the slashing and into the column as fast as we could load and fire. The 104th Pennsylvania aimed at the column and at the skirmishers approaching its right and flank. Unlike us, that regiment had no slashing in its front. The cleared field allowed the enemy to concentrate its fire upon it. The regiment rushed forward with spirit, jumped a rail fence in its front, and with a shout and a yell, but it was met so resolutely, and with such a galling fire by the foe, that it fell back in disorder, and did not appear on the field as an organization again during the day. Colonel Davis was wounded, and his Ringgold regiment fought its first battle. The 104th Pennsylvania, falling back, cleared the field opposite the advancing column and gave the 98th New York a better opportunity to fire upon it. The charging mass staggered, stopped, and resumed its march again, broke in two, filled up its gaps, but sure and steady, with its flags and banners waving, it moved like a tramp of fate. Then, scattered, broken, it passed our right and pressed for the batteries. We poured our volley into it, and the gaps were made. The swaths we moved could see in the column, for they were only 10 or 15 rods away. The men behind pressed those before, and the head finally reached the redoubt. One of the mounted leaders ascended the parapet and was shot with a pistol by an artillery officer. The whole column staggered and sank to the earth. Garland's command would rumble toward Nagley. The initial contact would be violent, scattering the Federals through the abattis before rallying. Robert Rhodes would arrive at the clearing before Seven Pines and push his command in his Palmer's brigade, which likewise would break through the redoubt after a brief firefight. Couch's command would attempt to form a new defensive line, but Hill had swept Casey's redoubt, and the running troops would take some of Couch's inexperienced command with them. Couch would attempt to rally his men and actually sent some regiments to flank Rhodes, but a battery accompanying his brigade would dissuade this attempt. We have an account of the second line of defense from the Confederate perspective. Captain J. Lawrence Meem of Lynchburg, who until Garland's promotion was adjutant of the 11th Regiment, was now General Garland's chief of staff, met us with word to the front to hurry, but this time all were out of breath, but rushed on in increased speed through mud and water, almost knee-deep in some places. Again, a messenger is sent from General D.H. Hill to hurry. It is critical time at the front, and the enemy has been driven from his breastworks and camps, but there are not enough men of the assaulting column left to occupy and hold the works. The men are doing all that mortal men can do. Some are falling by the wayside from sheer exhaustion. Nothing but excitement keeps any on their feet. General Kemper said to the messenger, "Tell General Hill I am left in front and would like to change." The messenger replied, "No time to change now. Hurry on." Soon the brigade emerged from the woods into the open field on the farther side, which the Yankee breastworks and camps were located, but not a living soldier, Yankee or Confederate, was in sight. I have said living soldier because as we rushed along by the edge of this field, over which the Confederates had charged, the ground was thickly strewn with dead Confederates, close up to the Yankee breastworks and redoubts, where stood their abandoned cannon. Passing beyond these works, Generals Hill and Garland with their staff officers were seen waiting, behind a pile of cordwood, the coming of the brigade, which was directed to file to the right through the Yankee camp, with their small fly tents still standing, where, facing towards the enemy, the ever rank was the front. But this made little or no difference. Like the English fore and aft, the men fight from front or rear rank just the same. As the brigade filed out through the camp, a terrific fire was opened by the Yankees, who had rallied or been reinforced by fresh troops 100 or 2 yards beyond their camp. The Yankee lines could not be seen on account of the smoke and fog, but the balls flew thick through the air, killing and wounded many. The men, lying flat on the ground, returned their fire as best they could. In a short time, someone gave the order to fall back to that abandoned Yankee breastwork, some 40 or 50 yards to the rear, which afforded protection from the enemy's shots. This order was obeyed in double-quick time, all hurrying over the breastworks, getting on the reverse side, into the ditch half filled with water, preferring the cold water to hot lead. So that gives us a pretty good idea, because kind of the confused nature of the fighting and the back and forth nature as well of the fighting through the enemy camp, through the breastworks, past the field. So it's kind of a back and forth. Gives us a good picture of the ebb and flow of this combat. Nagley had checked brigades under Rains and Anderson to the north of the Williamsburg Road, but with added pressure from Jenkins, who could break Abercrombie, and the addition of Kemper's command, this would prove too much. Confederates would flank Couch's defensive line, which had been holding its own for some time. Casey and Couch's commands would both be in retreat, the Confederates in possession of the crossroads at Seven Pines. The Union troops would move to Savage Station, a more western stop on the railroad, to regroup. In the meantime, reinforcements had begun to arrive from Heintzelman's Third Corps in the form of Phil Kearny, who would engage Rhodes, who had to turn his command to face this threat. While they might have been able to turn the tide on the first day, they would retreat with the Fourth Corps. Kearny was not alone, though, in the form of additional federal troops on the way. Sumner's 2nd Corps was preparing to move to join the action. It would be tough going due to the river and road conditions, but eventually they would start to form defensively north of Fair Oak Station. Whiting and his command on the Confederate side would not, though, Johnson choosing to leave him in place, as he was not aware Hill had in fact launched his part of the deal. Whiting would move down the 9-mile road, however, and be set upon by the Union 2nd Corps, who had arrived and deployed around the Adams House. Whiting's command would attempt to assault the Union troops, but would be repulsed. We have an account from Hatton's brigade. As we were passing along the road at double quick, President Jefferson Davis pressed us by his suite of attendants. Every boy snatched off his hat, and the wild rebel yell rent the air as a salute to the gallant chieftain of the Confederacy. On we dashed, and at every bound nearer, clearer, deadlier resounded the clash of arms. When we reached a little schoolhouse on the left side of the road, we were halted. Just beyond the house, on a little mound, was General Johnson, seated upon his big gray horse, and glasses adjusted, looking at the enemy. Turning around, I heard him ask the question, "What command is this?" General Haddon replied, "Tennessee Brigade." "Put them right in," said General Johnson. General Haddon, turning around to his men, gave the command, "Load." There was a General Randolph Steele, as this command was repeated by the company officers down the line. When my gun was loaded, I looked. There was Johnson's horse, but the saddle was empty. A bomb had burst. Johnson was wounded. The next command from General Haddon was "Fix bayonets." Every soldier knows what that means. It means that somebody is going to get hurt. It means that the dreadful tread of a thundering legion, mixed with the wild rebel yell, and something must move. The next command was "Forward, guide center." The sons of Tennessee began to move. I have always thought that this was the grandest, sublimest scene I ever saw. The 3 regiments were moving in perfect line. Above us floated the stars and bars and the cross of St. Andrew, the flag we loved. Our arms were gleaming, glittering, glistening amid the splendors of sunset glow. On we moved toward the sunset with a dreadful tread more terrible than that of Napoleon's thundering legions. Above us, and all around us, grape and canister and bombs were falling thick and fast, tearing up the earth in front and rear, but the line was never struck. It seemed to me that I was 6 inches taller than I ever was. When gone about 100 yards, again, the stentorian voice of Colonel Turney ran out, and the thunder of the battle. "First Tennessee charge, forward, on 1st Company." This changed the direction of the 1st Regiment from west to north. I glanced back and saw General Haddon going west with the 2 other regiments, with his hat off, waving them onward. Our regiment, moving north, passed through a skirt of timber where the Yankees had been camped. Their tents were stretched. They had been whipped out. And we had passed through, we were ordered to halt and lie down. It was now sunset, and deadly missiles and treetops were falling around us. In the dust, I raised up on my knees to look. Across a little clearing close to us was another skirt of woods. I saw the Yankee lines forming. I told the boys they were coming. Soon the company officers passed along the line commanding, "Up, boys." The boys came to their feet, guns in hand, and the racket of arms began. Right in the onset, everything was enveloped in smoke and darkness. We could shoot at the flash of the enemy's guns, and I suppose they would shoot at the flash of ours. Amid the din, the clatter of arms, the boom and thunder of cannon, and the crash of bayonets, both sides gave way. It was said that we were engaged 3 minutes. I know I fired my gun only 3 times, and I was as calm and deliberate and busy as I could be. So this also gives you a pretty good and vivid description and quite colorful language as well of just the kind of emotion with this charge that was conducted. Whiting would try again, this time throwing Haddon's brigade in the middle to move on the Northerners, but this too is going to be repulsed. Haddon would be killed and Pettigrew severely wounded. Hood had been sent to try to wedge himself between the Yankee line, but he had got himself lost in the waning hours. Johnson and staff would ride down the 9-mile road toward the conclusion of the second assault by Whiting. It would be here that Johnson was hit in the chest, a severe wound that would remove him from the Army command. We have an account of this by a member of his staff. Most of General Johnson's staff have been sent off, on duty except myself and Colonel Blank, and the air seemed to be alive with whizzing bullets and bursting shells. Colonel Blank moved his head from side to side as if trying to dodge them. General Johnson turned toward him and smiling said, "Colonel, there's no use of dodging. When you hear them, they have passed." Just after saying this, a shell exploded immediately in his front, striking the general from his horse, severely wounded and unconscious. I immediately sprang forward, catching him in my arms, carried him out of the enemy's fire. Others coming to my assistance, we moved him back about a quarter mile, and laying him down, hastily sent for a stretcher. He then regained consciousness, and finding that he had lost his sword and pistol, said, "The sword was one worn by my father in the old Revolutionary War. I would not lose it for $10,000. Will not someone please go back and get that and the pistols for me?" And several others and myself volunteered. On returning to the battle, we found our line had been considerably pressed back, and the spot where General Johnson fell to be midway between the line and the battle, which was blazing in all its fury, with men falling around like leaves. I dashed through the line to the spot where the general had fallen, snatched up the sword and pistols, jumped upon my horse, and was making back to our lines, when I hadn't got more than 20 yards, when one of the pistols fell out of my hand. I quickly sprang to the ground, picked it up, when, just as I did, a discharge of grape from a battery of artillery planted within 150 yards from where I was tore up the earth all around me. But I leaped upon my horse and reached our line safely, where I met one of the men who had volunteered to go back for the swords and pistols. He demanded me to turn them over to him. I said, "No, I will take them to the general myself." He replied, "I am your superior officer, and I have the right to order you." I said, "Superior officer or not, you will not get the sword and these pistols, unless you are a better man than I am, and I don't think you are." So it gives you an idea of also kind of the confusion of battle there, and having to perform this kind of crazy task as well, I think is also sort of telling. Davis and Lee would also be present, the graveness of the day really showing. This battle was in late May of 1862, and in April of 1862, simply the month prior, the commanding general of the forces in the Western Theater, Albert Sidney Johnston, had died at Shiloh. So it's not too far removed from that disaster. Albert Sidney Johnston and Joseph E. Johnston were both considered to be very high-level generals, right? Joseph E. Johnston is the highest-ranking regular Army officer to defect to the Confederacy. Albert Sidney Johnston was considered by many to be kind of this powerhouse of a general who had seen service in the Utah War, amongst other conflicts, and he was also supposed to be kind of holding down the ship in the West. And unfortunately, it doesn't happen for him. He dies at Shiloh, where he might have been saved by a simple field tourniquet. And now you have General Johnson, who right in front of Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, ironically enough, he is going to be very severely wounded. He's not going to be able to command anymore. In the initial aftermath of the wounding, Lee was actually tabbed to take control of the army. However, not being aware of Johnson's attack plan, it was decided that Gustavus Smith would get the duty. The only problem with this is going to be that Smith was also unaware of what the attack plan was supposed to be, as Johnson had not told him. This again points back to kind of the confusing nature of the assault, the confusion and inexperience of the officers who were trying to execute it. The situation that had fallen the first day was going to be that of just general confusion. Whiting was where he had stopped along the 9-mile road. Hill had pulled back to 7 Pines with Longstreet somewhere in between. Huger was somewhere not engaged. The Union forces, meanwhile, had rallied. With the depleted 4th Corps off the field, they would remain at Savage's Station, with the 2nd and 3rd making a continuous line along the railroad, and then across the Williamsburg Road as well. Eliminating an isolated part of the army had failed. Part of this would be the green nature of the troops. It was a complicated maneuver, and road conditions were just as bad for the Confederates as they had been for the attacking Union troops. Smith would resolve to fight the next day. He would call on Longstreet to come up with some kind of attack plan. Longstreet would use his men to screen Hooker along the road, and then hopefully flank Sedgwick of the 2nd Corps. Whiting would then hold Sedgwick in place. The problem was that the attack would hit Dick Richardson's command along the railroad, where French's brigade was supported by Howard. Kearny's division would fill the gap in between Hooker and Richardson. Neither side would be fully prepared for any kind of attack. They were fairly scattered in the woods, but the initiative would need to be seized. Very famously, you have several stories of when the armies kind of stop, because they stop on the field, like right where they are, and then they are going to be so close to each other that they're going to, be able to hear each other. Sometimes there's going to be individuals who are walking into each other's camps. So that kind of just adds to the general layer of confusion here. We can be critical of Longstreet that 7 Pines is a battle in which he tries to remove himself from any blame. Huger gets railroaded for Longstreet not understanding his orders. What is more is that Longstreet, despite helping to plan the attack on June 1st, would leave D.H. Hill to carry it out. Importantly, Hill had not only not been part of that planning process, but also he was not aware Richardson sat in between Sedgwick and Hooker. As such, he would run into resistance on the first, Pickett leading the way, but then having to be supported by Mahone and Armstead. We have an account from Pickett's brigade. We stacked arms in the road and lounged about with indifference, many of the men picking up trinkets, old letters, packages of ground coffee, bundles or crackers, etc., which had been left by the enemy the day before. A few tents had been left standing. We were getting to be interested. In fact, we were having something of a picnic. I was standing near the head of the stacked arms, looking Yankee-wards, when suddenly puffs of smoke arose from the bushes around 300 yards in front, followed by the report of musketry, while here and there the thud of bullets against stumps and a few standing trees brought the picnic to a close. The command, fall in, was given by the adjutant, and in a few minutes a body of well-drilled soldiers was marching toward the bushes from whence it came, the shots that put up the end of the foraging. General Pickett rode up, and the column was halted, and the brigade formed in battle line. Forward march, steady boys, don't shoot until you see 'em, and many similar expressions were used. We had to scramble through the chevaux de frise left in the place by the enemy the day before, and the various obstructions which they had used to protect their rear when encamped on our picnic grounds. Marching forward through sharpened pine limbs, through patches of briars, the 19th was stopped, suddenly, by an immense frog pond, and no enemy in sight. By the left, march, was the order, and we went about 200 yards to the left, halted, faced to the front, and dressed upon the colors. Still no enemy in sight. We were in the edge of the forest. A road just at our rear, separating the woods from the old field. Lie down was the next order, which was cheerfully obeyed. I was standing near the center of the regiment, far enough to the rear to see the road some distance to the left, and observed troops crossing the road going toward our rear. This I reported to the colonel, who instructed me to display our flag, as they must be friends. Stepping back and looking again, I saw the United States flag, and then knew they were no friends. Approaching the colonel with the positive information, the tramp is distinctly heard in front. The rustling of leaves comes nearer. Blue coats are seen through the bushes, more and more numerous, coming directly toward us. The click of the many is heard as our boys prepare for action, and then the roar of musketry from the two lines of battle breaks upon the Sabbath day. Short, quick, and decisive was the work done, and the enemy leaving in less than 8 minutes at a quick rout of step. Again expecting the road, no sign of danger was seen, and this day I've never learned what became of the troops that crossed the road on our left. So that also gives us a pretty good idea of just the confusing nature of this action, right? You have troops moving in around behind. You know, we talk a lot about in this podcast about how, say, like the Wilderness, Chancellorsville, these are confusing actions because you're in the woods. Well, you really kind of get a good idea, a good picture of that in this account because you're not able to see anything around you, right? You only have your regiment with you, and you can see just how things can get out of hand pretty quickly. There's an enemy behind you. There's an enemy in front of you. You're just trying to have these small unit actions. That's what we talk about. We talked about that, especially when we talked about the Battle of Chickamauga, small unit actions where it's just going to be essentially regiment against regiment, and whoever wins, wins, right? The rebel attack would smash into Blinky French, scattering some Federals. Sumner would act quickly, the Irish brigade thrown in to stop the turning of the tide. Howard's brigade would also be heavily engaged by this attack, Howard losing his arm in the fight. We do have an account from Howard's command. At this point, the railroad ran through a piece of woods, and we, though facing occasional bullets from the enemy, could see but a short distance ahead of us. While in this place, waiting further orders, Colonel Barlow himself went forward into the woods to learn more of the situation. From the stray bullets coming over from our men, some were hit. It came to mind one or a few ingenious men in the ranks that a recumbent posture would conduce to safety, and he or they at once took it. This hint was taken by others, and in a very short time every man was flat on his belly. Presently the colonel appeared, and perhaps looked twice for his regiment he had left standing. He at once roared, "Who ordered you to lie down? Get up at once!" And every man was on his feet. Then came the order, "Forward, guide center, march," and we entered the woods. At this point the temperature was quite heavy, and there was considerable small growth. Underfoot it was swampy. It was impossible to maintain a good line. In such an advance, the naturally courageous will press forward, and the naturally timid will hang back, and the officers and file closers have their hands full to urge the laggards. In my place as orderly, I was directed behind Lieutenant W. H. M. McIntyre, commanding my company. Next to me on the left was Corporal Wiley, an old friend from my town. As we were working our way to the front, he spoke to me and said, "Charlie, am I hurt much?" I looked up and saw the blood running down the side of his face, and that part of his ear had been shot away. I said, "No, nothing but a part of your ear is gone," and we pressed forward. This is Tim breaking into the quote here. If that's not hardcore, I don't know what else is. Just, yep, part of your ear is gone. So, gives you a really good idea of, the toughness of some of these guys. Soon we came upon the 52nd New York. I think of French's brigade lying on the ground in line of battle. I suppose they had exhausted their ammunition and were waiting for our appearance. We passed over them and advanced a few rods when the order was given to halt. Then strenuous efforts were made by our officers to get the men up in the ranks and address the line. While this was going on, no firing was had on either side. I did not see a rebel and did not think one was in a musket shot. Lieutenant McIntyre stood in the captain's place, and I immediately behind him in the place of the first sergeant. Suddenly a tremendous volley was fired by the enemy at short range, which was very destructive. McIntyre sank down with a deathly pallor on his countenance. He said, "I'm killed," and stooped down and said, "Lieutenant, do you think you are mortally wounded?" He replied, "Yes, tell them I'm killed." He never spoke again. So also another good picture of just the confusing nature of the fighting. Like, you didn't even think that the enemy was close enough to be able to fire upon you, have a clear field of fire. But again, in these kinds of conditions for this battle, especially once again early in the war, it's just going to be that much more confusing. If the year was 1863, then maybe the attack could have found some legs. But in the confusion, the break was not exploited, and the Confederates would be forced to fall back. Hooker would briefly skirmish with Wilcox, who had been left to check him, but amazingly the battle would essentially end. Confederates would remove themselves back to the Richmond defenses, and the Union forces would reoccupy the ground that they had lost. Casualties had been roughly 6,000 Confederates and 5,000 Federals, making for an even larger list than Williamsburg. But what exactly are we going to make of Seven Pines, also called Fair Oaks? Well, it is really the first real battle we have in the East, or the main theater. The casualties on both sides would be shocking, and both sides would get much needed experience to make them into the competent fighting forces that they will eventually become. While the battle was inconclusive, we have Johnson ceding command to Lee, which again is going to be important. Seven Pines will also be important as Johnson sort of sets up Lee very well. He has a very capable army that Johnson is going to be bitter of Lee after the fact that Lee's going to take and kind of, a la like say Alexander and Philip, you're going to get the keys to the Ferrari after I built the whole thing by hand, right? That's going to kind of be the attitude of Johnson. But what was more so is that also the strategy that Johnson had used for Seven Pines is also going to set up Lee eventually for these 7 days. McClellan was caught off guard. It was unexpected that this offensive action could have occurred, and the casualties on top of that are going to make him even more cautious. A more ambitious leader might have tried to capitalize on the rebel defeat, but Little Mac does not. He is puzzled that Johnson would have acted not defensively, which goes a long way for Lee to launch his 7 days assault. Lee taking over, he has Jeb Stuart right around McClellan, which gives Jeb some much needed street cred, but also shows that the right flank is now in the air. So Lee is going to be able to victimize the paralyzed McClellan with additional offensive action. So, right, we had, if you think about it, you had Seven Pines, all of that's kind of to the south of the Chickahominy River, but Lee's going to kind of employ the same logic because now we have shifted troops to the south. There's going to be less troops in the north, including Fitzjohn Porter, who's going to be the target of the initial 7 days battles. So he is going to be able to try to use the same kind of logic once he has the intelligence that Jeb Stuart provides to launch those assaults to the north. So let's go ahead and call it a day right there. I think we did Seven Pines more justice this time around than in the main narrative. Hopefully, having a fuller picture, we will have a better appreciation for this battle. We talked McClellan in some of these episodes, and we will continue that theme next time. We have to analyze this controversial figure in George B. McClellan, the young Napoleon. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.